Before we start, kindly subscribe to my channel and tell me, where in the universe are you watching from? Kel Voss groaned as his eyes fluttered open. His head throbbed, and the sharp scent of burned metal filled his nose. The ship's control panel flickered weakly, sparks snapping from broken wires. He pushed himself up, trying to remember what had happened. Right, the diplomatic mission. He had been sent to negotiate trade routes with the Zerin Empire, one of the most feared warrior races in the galaxy. Things had been going smoothly until... boom. The memory hit him like a shockwave. His ship had been shot down. With a curse, Kel staggered to his feet, checking his surroundings. The cockpit was in ruins, the emergency beacon was useless, and outside the cracked viewport was a dense alien jungle. Well, that's just perfect, he muttered. A sudden noise behind him made him freeze. The sound of a heavy metal door sliding open. Kel spun around, and his breath caught. Standing in the wreckage was a Zerin warrior, tall and imposing. Her armor gleamed under the dim emergency lights, and her piercing golden eyes locked onto him with a look of amusement. "You live," she said, voice smooth but edged with power. Kel swallowed hard. He recognized her instantly. General Vena Zarek, one of the most dangerous fighters in the Empire. If she was here, he was in serious trouble. "Not sure for how long," Kel muttered, lifting his hands in surrender. "If this is a hostage situation, can we at least negotiate my ransom?" Vena chuckled, stepping closer. "You misunderstand, human. You are not a hostage. You are mine." Kel blinked. "Excuse me?" Vena tilted her head, studying him like a puzzle she enjoyed solving. "Your ship fell into Zerin territory. By our laws, any outsider who survives must be claimed. And I," she smirked, "have claimed you as my husband." Kel stared at her. Then he laughed. "Oh, that's good. Really. Now, let's be serious." "I am serious." His smile faded. "You're joking." She crossed her arms. "Zerin warriors do not joke about marriage." Kel took a slow step back. This had to be some kind of warrior custom misunderstanding. "Look, General Vena, was it? I think there's been a mistake. You can't just marry me because my ship crashed." Vena raised an eyebrow. "You could have refused." "I am refusing," Kel said in exasperation. "No," she said calmly. "You could have fought me off when I claimed you. That is our way." Kel's stomach dropped. "Wait, when did this claiming happen?" Vena's smirk deepened. "You were unconscious." His mouth fell open. "That's cheating." She shrugged. "You were weak. That is not my fault." Kel groaned, running a hand through his hair. This was not how diplomacy was supposed to go. He had survived a crash, only to be kidnapped into marriage by a battle-hungry alien woman. "All right," he said, thinking fast. "Hypothetically speaking, what if I don't want to be your husband?" Vena's golden eyes gleamed. "Then you must challenge me and win." Kel sighed. He wasn't exactly the fighting type. His strengths were in talking, negotiating, and not getting punched in the face. Still, he had to try. "Fine," he said. "What kind of challenge are we talking about?" Vena's smirk widened. "Simple. You survived the first night in my care." Kel frowned. "That doesn't sound so." Vena stepped aside, revealing a small, dimly lit shelter. Inside was a single bed. Just one. Kel stared at it, then at her, then back at the bed. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me." Vena's voice was rich with amusement. "I never joke, husband." Kel Voss stood frozen, staring at the single bed in the small, dimly lit shelter. "Tell me you have another sleeping arrangement," he said, glancing at General Vena Zarek. The Zerin warrior leaned casually against the doorway, arms crossed, golden eyes gleaming with amusement. "Are you afraid of sharing a bed, husband?" Kel rubbed his temples. "I'm afraid of waking up with a knife at my throat if I roll over the wrong way." Vena chuckled, stepping inside. A proper Zerin wife would never attack her mate in his sleep. It would be dishonorable. That's oddly comforting, Kale muttered. But I'm still not convinced I should be your mate at all. Vena sat on the edge of the bed, watching him with a smirk. Then prove yourself worthy to challenge the claim. Kale sighed. He still wasn't sure how he had ended up in this situation. 1 minute, he was a diplomat trying to negotiate trade rights, and the next, he was trapped on an alien moon, married against his will to a battle-hungry warrior queen. If I survive the night, he said, eyeing her cautiously, then I get to challenge this whole marriage nonsense. Vena nodded. Yes, but you won't. Kale frowned. Excuse me. She stretched lazily, as if this was all a game to her. You will fail, human. Kale folded his arms. And why's that? Vena leaned forward slightly, voice smooth, because you are not prepared for the way Zarin couples sleep. A slow sense of dread settled in Cal's stomach. I really don't like the way you said that. She merely smirked and stood, stepping past him toward the control panel on the wall. With a press of a button, the shelter sealed shut, blocking out the humid jungle air. The soft hum of a climate regulator activated, cooling the room instantly. Kale let out a breath of relief. Okay, at least we won't be sweating all night. Vena gave him a sidelong glance. Oh, we will. Kale nearly choked on air. What? Vena tilted her head, amused by his reaction. Zarin warriors do not sleep alone. Our bodies run hot. We share warmth with our mates. Kale groaned. Of course you do. Vena stepped toward the bed and removed her armor piece by piece, setting it aside with precise, practiced movements. Kale quickly turned his gaze away, focusing very hard on the opposite wall. Are all humans this shy? She asked, her tone teasing. Kale cleared his throat. I'm not shy. I just don't casually strip in front of people I just met. You are my husband. For now, Kale muttered under his breath. Vena smirked. Come. The bed is large enough. Or would you rather sleep on the floor? Kale eyed the cold, hard ground. It looked uncomfortable. And given how dangerous this moon was, he wasn't sure if he wanted to be in a weak position when the night creatures started making noise outside. With a sigh, he approached the bed. Fine, but no funny business. Vena arched a brow. Funny business. Kale rolled his eyes. Just stay on your side, all right. She chuckled. I make no promises. Kale groaned and reluctantly lay down, keeping as much distance as possible. The bed was soft, surprisingly comfortable, but his entire body was tense. Vena, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease, lying beside him like this was the most natural thing in the world. For a long moment, there was silence. Then Kale sighed. This is the weirdest day of my life. Vena hummed, amused. Get used to it, husband. As Cal closed his eyes, he had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. Kel Voss lay stiffly on the edge of the bed, as far from General Vena Zarek as physically possible. The shelter was silent, except for the low hum of the climate controls and the distant calls of jungle creatures outside. He exhaled slowly, trying to relax. This wasn't so bad. He had survived a ship crash, an accidental marriage, and a terrifying cultural misunderstanding. Surely, sharing a bed for one night wouldn't be the worst part of his day. And yet, he was hyper-aware of Vena beside him. She wasn't doing anything, just breathing steadily, but the air between them felt charged. There was something about her presence, strong, confident, completely unbothered, that made Cal's thoughts spiral. Focus, Cal. She's just an alien warrior who claimed you as her husband. No big deal. He turned onto his side, facing the wall. If I just stay still and keep my distance, I'll be fine. Then Vena moved. A sharp jolt ran through Cal's body as he felt warmth press against his back. He froze. Vena, he whispered, you're on my side. A soft chuckle. We have no sides in Zarin bonding. Cal clenched his jaw. Well, Humans do, and mine is over here. She didn't move. If anything, she seemed more comfortable. Cale shut his eyes, taking a deep breath. Ignore it. Just ignore it. But that became impossible when she threw an arm over him. Cale's entire body locked up. Vena. She murmured, half asleep. You're hugging me. Zarine mates share warmth, she mumbled, voice drowsy, but clearly amused. It is practical. Cale groaned, practically vibrating with discomfort. It is not practical. It is invasion of personal space. She didn't respond. Cale tried to shift away, but her grip tightened, pulling him back against her. Oh, this is bad. Her strength was ridiculous. Even in sleep, she was holding him like a vice, and the worst part, she wasn't even trying. Cale exhaled sharply, forcing himself to remain calm. Okay, I can handle this. Just go to sleep, boss. Don't overthink it. Don't. Then, Vena nuzzled into his shoulder, sighing contently. Cale's brain short-circuited. She was asleep. He could tell by the steady rhythm of her breathing. But her unconscious instincts were wrecking his sanity. This was a warrior general, the same woman who had threatened to beat him into submission just hours ago. And now she was holding him like a treasured possession. Cale gritted his teeth. This had to be some kind of cosmic joke. Another long minute passed. He debated his options. Try to escape, high risk of getting squeezed tighter. Wake her up and demand space, high risk of her enjoying his struggle. Do nothing and suffer in silence. Currently winning. He sighed. Option 3 it is. Finally, Cale forced himself to relax. Maybe, just maybe, if he ignored her completely, he could pretend none of this was happening. Eventually, sleep found him. A sudden wake-up call. Cale didn't know how much time had passed when a deep, rumbling growl snapped him awake. His eyes flew open. Something was outside the shelter. The low, snarling sound grew louder. Predators. Cale barely had time to react before Vena moved like lightning. Her arm, previously wrapped around him, vanished in an instant. In the next second, she was already off the bed, fully alert and armed. Cale sat up, blinking. How had she reacted so fast? Vena stood near the entrance, blade drawn, golden eyes sharp. Stay back. Cale swallowed. You heard that in your sleep. I do not sleep lightly, she said, voice low and deadly serious. Cale's heart pounded. The sound outside wasn't stopping. Something big was circling their shelter. Vena smirked, rolling her shoulders. I was hoping for some entertainment tonight. Cale groaned. I really hope you don't mean fighting. She gave him a wild grin. I do. Cale shut his eyes. This night just kept getting worse. A deep, guttural growl echoed outside the shelter. Cale Voss's heartbeat slammed in his chest as the night predator circled them. The creature's low snarls vibrated through the walls, a reminder that he was trapped on a hostile alien moon, with no backup, no weapons, and only one dangerous ally. Vena Zarek. The Zarine warrior stood by the entrance, blade drawn, golden eyes gleaming like she was having the time of her life. Cale exhaled sharply. You're enjoying this. She grinned, muscles tense with anticipation. Of course. Zarine warriors do not cower from a fight. Cale groaned. Maybe we should try something revolutionary, like not fighting. Another snarl, this time closer. The air grew heavy with the scent of something wild. Cale inched toward the wall, eyes locked on the reinforced door. Please tell me this thing can't break in. Vena hummed, tilting her head. Depends. Cale stared at her. Depends. She smirked. On how hungry it is. As if on cue, a loud thud shook the shelter. The creature slammed against the metal, testing its strength. Cale nearly jumped out of his skin. Oh, great. It's hungry. Good to know. Vena rolled her shoulders. Then I should greet it properly. Before Cale could protest, she pressed a button on the control panel. and the door slid open. Cold air rushed in. Cal's breath caught. "You are out of your mind." But Vena didn't hesitate. She strode forward, stepping into the dark jungle beyond the threshold, her blade glinting under the alien moonlight. Cal scrambled to his feet. Nope. Absolutely not. This woman had zero self-preservation instincts. He moved cautiously toward the entrance and peered outside. The jungle was dense, full of twisting trees and bioluminescent plants that bathed the area in an eerie blue glow. The creature stood a few feet away, hulking, monstrous, and covered in jagged plating. Cal's stomach dropped. That thing was massive, at least twice Vena's size, and she was grinning. Vena crouched slightly, blade angled, ready for combat. "Stay inside, husband." Cal scoffed. "Oh, now you care about my safety." The creature lunged. Vena moved like lightning. She ducked under its massive claw, spinning to the side. Her blade slashed across its hide, sending a spray of dark blood into the air. The beast roared in fury. Cal backed up. "She's insane." The fight was brutal and fast. Vena was smaller, quicker, deadlier, dancing around the predator's attacks with effortless grace. Every movement was calculated, every strike perfectly placed. She was toying with it. Cal ran a hand down his face. This is entertainment for her. Then, a misstep. The creature swiped. Vena barely dodged, but the impact sent her skidding back. Cal's stomach twisted. Vena. She landed in a crouch, eyes blazing, chest rising and falling with exhilaration. Then she laughed. Cal blinked. "Are you actually having fun?" Vena grinned at him. "You should see your face, husband." The creature roared again, but Vena was already moving, this time, ending it. One final, precise strike. The beast collapsed, lifeless. Silence settled. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. Cal let out a slow exhale. "Remind me to never make you angry." Vena smirked, wiping her blade clean. "Smart man." Then she turned, stepping back into the shelter as if she hadn't just fought a monster for fun. Cal shook his head. This was his life now. As the door sealed behind them, Vena stretched and looked entirely pleased with herself. Cal collapsed onto the bed. That was stressful. Vena sat beside him, amused. "You will get used to it." He groaned. "That's what I'm afraid of." Vena smirked. "Sleep, husband. You survived the night." Cal shut his eyes, exhausted. But one thought lingered. He was starting to like this dangerous, ridiculous woman. And that was even more terrifying than the beast outside. Cal woke up to the smell of something surprisingly delicious. His eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, he forgot where he was. The shelter's dim lighting cast a warm glow over the room, and the jungle outside was eerily silent, a stark contrast to the chaos of last night. Then he spotted Vena. She stood near the small cooking station, flipping what looked like strips of cooked meat over a portable heat panel. Her posture was relaxed, her movements precise, as if battling a monster the size of a hovercraft hours ago had been nothing but a warm-up. Cal sat up slowly, stretching. "You cook." Vena smirked, but didn't turn. A warrior must know how to survive in any situation. Cal scoffed. "Yeah, but actual cooking. That's a little domestic, don't you think?" She finally looked over her shoulder, golden eyes glinting with amusement. "Would you rather starve?" He held up his hands. "Did I say I was complaining?" Vena chuckled, setting 2 plates down on the small metal table. "Eat." Cal hesitated before sitting across from her. He eyed the food cautiously. It looked edible. Smelled even better. He picked up a piece and took a small bite. His eyes widened. "This is actually really good." Vena arched a brow. "Did you expect me to poison you?" Cal swallowed. "Not poison. Just alien food usually doesn't go well for humans." She tilted her head. "If I wished to harm you, husband, I would not need poison. Kale let out a tired sigh. That's very comforting. Thank you. Vena smirked, clearly enjoying herself. They ate in relative peace, though Kale couldn't help but notice the way she watched him. Not like an enemy, not even like a warrior studying an opponent, but something else. Something that made his chest feel strangely tight. Before he could say anything, the shelter's control panel beeped. Kale frowned. What's that? Vena rose to her feet, her easygoing expression shifting into something sharp and serious. She walked over and tapped a sequence on the panel. A small holographic screen appeared, displaying a Zarian warship entering the moon's atmosphere. Kel's stomach dropped. We're not alone anymore. Vena's jaw clenched. No. And I know that ship. The transmission crackled to life, and a deep, commanding voice filled the shelter. Vena Zarek, report your status. Kale did not like the way that voice sounded, authoritative, cold, and full of expectation. Vena's expression remained unreadable. Commander Rivos. Kale glanced between her and the screen. Who's this guy? A high-ranking officer in my fleet, Vena said, voice clipped. And an inconvenience. Kale winced. That doesn't sound good. Vena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pressed the communication switch and spoke in a firm, controlled tone. I am unharmed. There is no need for interference. A pause. Then, Commander Rivos's voice lowered. We detected a human life signature. Explain. Kale tensed. Vena's fingers tightened into a fist. He is under my protection. Another pause. Then, the commander's next words sent a chill down Kale's spine. That human is coming with us. Immediately. Kale muttered under his breath. Well, that's not good. Vena turned off the transmission, her expression unreadable. Then, without hesitation, she turned to Kale and said, pack your things. Kale blinked. Wait, we're running. She grinned, sharpening her blade. No, we're fighting. Kale rubbed his temples. You're joking. Vena's golden eyes gleamed with excitement. I never joke about battle. He groaned. Of course you don't. Outside, the Zarian warship was descending fast. The sleek black vessel cut through the sky, its engines humming with power. This wasn't just a scouting ship. This was a problem. Kale took a step back, waving a hand. Okay, maybe we should think about this. Fighting an entire squad of elite alien warriors seems unnecessary. Vena smirked. You underestimate me, husband. No, I'm accurately estimating them. Kale exhaled, shaking his head. I don't suppose we could just, I don't know, talk our way out of this. Vena's grin widened. You wish to negotiate with Zarian warriors. Kale crossed his arms. I'm a diplomat. That's kind of what I do. She tilted her head, considering him for a moment. Very well, diplomat. Let us see if your tongue is as sharp as my blade. Kale choked on air. Could you not phrase it like that? But before he could argue more, the warship landed. The ground rumbled, dust kicking up as the ship's sleek doors hissed open. A ramp descended, and down stepped Commander Rivos. Kale didn't need to know much about Zarian hierarchy to tell this guy was trouble. He was taller than most, his posture rigid, his piercing gaze locked directly on Vena. Not Kale. Kale had seen that look before. It was the look of a man who thought he had a claim. He really hated that look. Vena Zarek, Rivos said, his deep voice echoing. You failed to report your marriage to the High Council. Kale blinked. Wait, that was a requirement. He turned to Vena. You didn't tell them. Vena shrugged. They would have been dramatic about it. Rivos's eyes narrowed. You brought a human into our ranks without approval. Kale sighed. Wow, you guys really love your paperwork, huh? Rivos ignored him, stepping closer. You will return with me, Vena. The High Council will decide how to handle this mistake. Vena's muscles tensed, her hand resting on her blade. I do not require permission for my choices. Kale was almost flattered. Almost. But mostly he was focused on the part where they were trying to take him away. Okay. He stepped between them, raising his hands. Let's just take a breath. No need to pull out weapons. Rivos glared down at him. You have no place here, human. Kale huffed. Yeah. Well, your place seems awfully focused on my wife. Silence. Vena let out a quiet laugh. Kale glanced at her, not helping. She smirked. You amuse me. Rivos's expression darkened. This alliance is an insult. You are not worthy of her. Kale bristled. Listen here, Warlord wanted. But he didn't get to finish. Because the Zerin warriors behind Rivos moved. Fast. Vena grabbed Kel's wrist and yanked him back as two soldiers lunged. In one swift motion, she flipped Kel onto her back and took off running. Kel yelled, Are we seriously doing this? Vena laughed. Yes, husband. Blaster fire ripped through the air behind them. Kel clung to her shoulders, barely keeping his balance as she leaped over jagged rocks, moving faster than should have been possible. Vena shouted, still wished to negotiate. Kel groaned. I hate everything about this. Vena smirked. You love it. He did not dignify that with an answer. Kel's heart was pounding. Every step they took, every twist and turn Vena made, only got them further into the thick jungle. The Zerin warriors were close, too close. He could hear them in the distance, shouting orders, their boots crashing through the underbrush. Kale gripped Vena's shoulders tighter. He wasn't exactly sure how long he could keep up. Her movements were effortless. Every leap, every sprint seemed like second nature to her. He wasn't so sure about his own abilities. How far are we going? He asked, trying to catch his breath. Vena glanced over her shoulder, flashing a quick, amused grin. As far as we need to. Right. Kale wiped his brow. And what's the plan when we don't outrun them? Vena didn't answer immediately. She darted around a huge tree, sliding under a low branch, and Kale barely managed to follow her. They ran for what felt like hours, with Cal's legs screaming for relief. Vena, on the other hand, seemed tireless. At least the forest was on their side, dense with trees, vines, and swirling mist that gave them a natural advantage. The warriors weren't used to the unpredictable jungle terrain, but Vena moved as if it was her natural environment. Her instincts were razor-sharp. Vena. Kale called out, pulling his feet from the thick mud. Slow down a little. She glanced back again, her face a mix of determination and amusement. You'll be fine, husband. Don't call me husband like it's nothing, he complained, dodging a vine that nearly whipped him in the face. But she was already ahead, her focus back on the chase. Kale couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration. He had no idea what they were supposed to do once they were cornered. If they were cornered, could they fight their way out? Or would he get shot by one of those laser rifles the Zerin soldiers carried? A loud crash behind them snapped him out of his thoughts. Vena whirled around. Get down. Before Kale could react, she dropped to the ground, tackling him. They rolled across the wet ground, the sound of heavy footsteps growing louder. Cal's heart nearly leaped into his throat as the Zerin warriors' voices filled the air. They were too close. Kale tried to catch his breath, but all he could do was watch Vena. She was pressed against him, her body flush against his. His pulse raced, not from fear, but from something else. Vena was completely calm, her eyes scanning the environment like a predator. She seemed to have an impossible level of control. Stay still, she whispered, barely moving her lips. He nodded, his chest rising and falling with quick breaths. The warriors passed them, their metal boots clanking loudly on the forest floor. He couldn't help but notice how close they were, how perfectly still they had to remain. Vena's body was pressed against his so tightly that he could feel the rhythm of her breath. For a brief moment, it felt like the world was silent, like it was just the two of them in the jungle. Cal's heart skipped, and it wasn't because of the soldiers anymore. It was because of how close they were, how warm she felt against him. He could feel the heat radiating off her. Then, without warning, Vena shifted, her lips brushing against his ear as she whispered, "Stay alert." It was a command, and Cale knew it wasn't just for the fight. They were a team now. As the last of the soldiers moved past them, Cale let out a silent breath, slowly untangling himself from her. "Nice job," he muttered, rubbing his face. Vena shot him a sideways glance. "We'll get out of this. But first." She suddenly reached out and pulled him closer. Her lips met his, soft but firm. For a moment, Cale was too stunned to react, but then something clicked. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a promise. As quickly as it had started, she pulled away. "Focus." Cale blinked, his head spinning. "Right. Focus." Vena stood up and offered her hand to him. "Let's keep moving." Cale took her hand, his pulse still racing from the kiss. He had no idea what would happen next, but for the first time since this all started, he wasn't so sure he wanted to leave. Cale's legs were aching, his chest heaving as they continued their flight through the jungle. Vena was still in the lead, navigating the dense underbrush like a shadow, her every movement fluid and precise. She was a warrior, and this was her element. Not a single hesitation. Cale, on the other hand, was starting to wonder if his body would even hold up for much longer. They'd been running for what felt like hours, with no clear destination. Every time he asked where they were going, Vena's response was always the same: away. They needed a plan, a real one. The distant sound of Zarin soldiers crashing through the trees was a constant reminder that they weren't free yet. They were being hunted, and soon enough, Vena's charm and speed would no longer be enough to keep them ahead. "We need to make a stand," Cale said, voice a little more desperate than he intended. Vena stopped abruptly, turning to face him. Her golden eyes gleamed with determination, but there was something else there too: concern. "Are you sure you want to fight?" she asked, voice steady but with an edge of something softer. Cale nodded, catching his breath. "I'm not just going to run forever, you know. We have to do something." Vena's lips twitched into a smile, but it was faint. "Very well." Without another word, she moved toward a nearby cliffside, gesturing for him to follow. Cale hesitated but did as she asked, scrambling up the rocky incline with her help. They'd reached the top and crouched down behind the cover of large overgrown boulders. From their vantage point, Cale could see the Zarin soldiers below, moving in tight formation. They were closing in. "Think they'll just walk right into our trap?" Cale whispered, still trying to catch his breath. Vena didn't answer immediately. She was watching the soldiers, her expression one of calm focus. Then, in a flash, she stood up, her blades drawn, and in a smooth, powerful motion, she shouted, "Come and face me." The Zarin warriors froze, all eyes snapping to her. Cale's heart raced, but he forced himself to stand, even if his body screamed at him to lie down and recover. "You've made a mistake, Vena Zarek." Rygos's voice rang out across the jungle. The commander was at the front of the group, his expression hard and unyielding. "We'll bring you back, and the human goes with us." Vena's lips curled into a smile, and for the first time, Cale saw a hint of what she was truly capable of. "Then you will die trying." Cale's stomach flipped. Was she serious? Before he could respond, Vena charged forward, her movements fluid and dangerous. Cale instinctively followed, although he wasn't exactly sure what he could do in the face of such overwhelming odds. The first warrior lunged at her, but Vena danced out of the way. Her blade came down, and the soldier dropped. Cale tried to keep up, but his limbs felt heavy. That didn't stop him from swinging wildly at any enemy who came too close. He wasn't a fighter, not like Vena, but he wasn't going to let her face this alone. He parried a soldier's strike, barely avoiding being hit, but in that moment, Vena was everywhere. Her blade flashed, and a Zarin warrior went down with a cry. The next came at her with a roar, but she was already moving, fighting like a storm. Kale couldn't help but stare at her, mesmerized by her speed and precision. She was unstoppable, and the soldiers were quickly realizing that they were outclassed. But even so, the numbers were still against them. There were too many Zarin warriors closing in. "Vena," Kale shouted, barely dodging a blow. "We can't keep this up. There's too many of them." Vena didn't look back. "We don't need to." With a wild laugh, she did something Kale didn't expect. She leaped into the air, using her blade to slash through a vine, and the ground below gave way. The soldiers were too slow to react, and the entire group of them went tumbling into a pit, their screams echoing. Kale blinked, utterly shocked. Vena landed gracefully beside him, her chest rising and falling from the exertion. "We are not done yet." He could hardly breathe, but he managed to grin. "I think I'm in love with you." Vena turned to him, her golden eyes softer than usual. "Then you better keep up, husband." Kale chuckled, his heart racing for a whole new reason now. He had no idea what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure: they weren't out of danger yet. But as long as they had each other, maybe, just maybe, they stood a chance.